recommendations. They're fundamental recommendations. As outlined in this recent paper in Journal of Radiological Protection, Clement et al., published at the end of last year. So I want to mainly talk about what ICRP are doing, this process of revision, and then mention briefly the IRPA task group that's been set up to provide input and response to ICRP during this process, and our SRP working group set up to feed into IRPA, and also when we have the opportunity to respond directly to ICRP. So, ICRP fundamental recommendations, the last three are listed there. So the last ones, publication 103, 2007, ICRP are now thinking it's time to start the process of updating and revising these general recommendations. And as has already been said, this is a long-term process. They're aiming for something like 2030, so 8 years from now. And it's a very large program of work. The fundamental recommendations, of course, are the basis of protection standards worldwide and legislation in different countries. So, what might change? And Clement et al. Gave an initial outline, and obviously that will be built on. Certainly, low dose risk estimates will change. The question is by how much. Dose quantities, we have indications that there will be changes. There is the need for clarification and better guidance on various aspects of application of the system as well. And ICRP is obviously aware of that. So I want to go through each of these in turn, starting with these low dose risk estimates, or so-called stochastic detriment. What this slide shows is the steps, very simply, taken in calculating stochastic detriment. So starting with cancer, very largely starting with cancer incidence in the A-bomb survivors, Japanese A-bomb survivors, and then going through these steps and arriving at these values with which we are familiar of around a lifetime risk or detriment of around 5% per sievert. But with two values specified here, one for the working population and a higher value for the public. So these are lifetime risk averaged over a working age population or the whole population, and you can see it's dominated by cancer with a small addition of for hereditary risks or heritable risks. So in terms of revision, ICRP has a very large program of work underway, and this is an indication in terms of one publication which is currently in press, should be out any time, and a list of task groups that are working currently. So the publication 152 looked at the methodology and detailed analysis of the methodology that was used in publication 103 for the 2007 recommendations. There is now a new task group 122, which has begun the process. Obviously, this will take some years of updating these detriment calculations for cancer. Then there's a task group 91 looking at low dose risk inference, low dose and dose rate exposure, essentially looking at whether dose and dose rate effectiveness factor should be used as is currently used, a value of 2 for solid cancer, or whether some other approach should be used. That's going from high dose rate to low doses and dose rates that we're usually concerned with. So if it weren't for that factor of 2, then low dose risk estimates would be around 10% per sievert rather than 5% per sievert. Then task group 119, looking at diseases of the circulatory system, and importantly, whether they should be included in low dose risk. Task group 121, looking at effects in offspring and next generation. So that's heritable effects, but also in utero effects. So a very large program of work. One thing, in passing, one thing that's not going to change is the use of a linear no-dose, non-threshold dose-response relationship at low doses. And what I'm showing here is the front cover of a recent review, 2018, from the US ICRP, which looked at all relevant epidemiology and came to the conclusion that, as shown here, the LNT model is prudent and practical for radiological protection purposes. And more recent epidemiology also supports that, is consistent with that conclusion. And the front cover of another review, this time from UNSCEAR, looking at the biological data, biological basis mechanisms, and with the conclusion, that there remains good justification for the use of a non-threshold model for risk inference, given the robust knowledge of the role of mutation and chromosomal aberrations in carcinogenesis. Yes, so in terms of the epidemiology, increasing evidence of this dose response going down to lower doses. And indeed, studies showing that even if you consider just the results, low doses below 100 millisieverts, disregarding higher doses, there is still statistically significant dose response. So evidence for the use of a linear non-threshold dose response relationship. So summarizing in terms of questions on risks at low doses, LNT is here to stay, but should it still be regarded as prudent and so possibly conservative, or should it be regarded as a realistic assumption? It'd be interesting what ICRP, the wording used by ICRP. And then this dose and dose rate effectiveness factor, will there be continued use of value of 2, or will that be removed, 1 being equivalent to no correction or something else? And then will there be inclusion of circulatory diseases at low doses? Without either of those changes, we remain around the 5% per sievert, but with both those changes, then there could be significant changes to risk estimates. Moving on to dose quantities, there have been 2 important recent reports. One from ICRP, publication 147, on the use of dose quantities. One from ICRU, report 95, that's jointly with ICRP, in fact, on operational quantities for external radiation exposure. Publication 147 came to a number of conclusions, including those shown here. So use of absorbed dose rather than equivalent dose to set limits for the prevention of tissue reactions. So that's obviously absorbed dose in grey. And then continued use of effective dose, of course, for the control of stochastic effects. And publication 147 also discussed in some detail the relationship between dose and risk, with conclusion that effective dose can be used, and this is the words from the report, as an approximate indicator of possible risk, recognizing that risks vary with age at exposure, sex, and population group, and also recognizing the uncertainties associated with low dose risk estimation. Then on the ICRU report, proposed changes to the operational quantities from the current dose equivalent quantities to these new personal dose, ambient dose, relating those to measures of effective dose in the ICRP, ICRU anthropomorphic phantoms. So it's directly relating the measurement quantities to effective dose in the phantoms. And absorbed, also proposing absorbed dose quantities for individual organs and tissues for the skin and the lens of the eye. Yes, so here's the ICRP set of anthropomorphic phantoms, and of course it's the adult phantoms that are used for the operational quantities and for ICRP dose coefficients for workers and the adult members of the public, but there are also a range of phantoms for children of different ages, which are used in the calculation of dose coefficients for members of the public as children. What isn't done at the moment is to take into account differences in detriment between the sexes and at different ages of exposure. We use these averaged values, the average for the population of around 5% for CVET for all of these ages. We could, or so we, ICRP could calculate effective dose coefficients using age and sex specific detriment and the tissue weighting factors that related to those age and sex specific detriment values. What I'm showing here is an example from publication 147 for medical diagnostic X-ray examinations, considering the risk from the examination expressed as the effective dose from that. So it's a risk per unit effective dose from each of the different examination types, including CT, a range of radiographic X-ray procedures. So what it shows is the difference in risk per unit effective dose, the difference between males and females, with the female risk at a particular age being somewhat higher, and the risk as a function of age, obviously higher values at younger ages. The dashed lines are for uniform whole body irradiation, and the variation around that is the result of the different sets of organs and tissues that are irradiated in different medical procedures. So this sort of information could be used in the normal calculation of effective dose. So in summary, on dose quantities, Will ICRP change to the use of absorbed dose for control of tissue reactions as proposed in publication 147? If so, would that lead to the use of radiation weighting separately for stochastic effects and tissue reactions? That would make good sense on the available scientific evidence. There's another task group looking at that currently. Will the proposed ICRU operational quantities be implemented following the issue of new general recommendations from ICRP as proposed? And then more speculatively at the end here, should there be age and sex specific effective dose? Moving on to applications of the system, there are a number of current task groups. Task group 105, considering this question of including the environment when applying the system of protection. 114 on reasonableness and tolerability in the system. And then 124 on the principle of justification, really looking at ethical considerations there. And the ICRP recognises high priorities and therefore probably will set up task groups on exposure situations and categories of exposure and this issue of individual response and individualisation of dose and risk. Okay, so we're all familiar with the central principles of protection, justification, optimization, and dose limitation. If we look at optimization, what I'm showing here is the precise wording from the 2007 recommendations. So the likelihood of incurring exposures, the number of people exposed, and the magnitude of their individual doses should be kept as low as reasonably achievable, taking into account economic and social factors. So it's really quite a complex set of judgments there, not the pressure on getting doses lower and lower. And I think that's something that is an issue, is raised by, seen as a problem by many people, including ICRP. Yes, on dose limitation, that third principle, ICRP in the Clement et al. Paper suggested that it might be replaced, could possibly be replaced by protection of individuals using reference levels, noting that dose limits are for regulatory control and apply only in planned exposure situations, whereas reference levels apply in all exposure situations. And then on exposure situations, I think there's a feeling that these are helpful, but there can be complications and difficulties, particularly in moving between one exposure situation and another, or in operations where it might be considered that there are two exposure situations being dealt with at the same time, an existing and a planned situation, for example. So further guidance on that would be very helpful. And integration of protection of the environment, talked about a lot, but not really that clear. So another area where guidance would be helpful. So in summary, there could possibly be changes to the principles of protection, this third principle on dose limitation, general consensus that there needs to be more advice on how to deal with optimization of very low doses of exposures, clarity on how to deal with different exposure situations, this issue of individualization of protection, and that's particularly emphasized in medical applications, and then integration of the environment. So that was a very quick run through of some of what ICRP is doing and where they might be going. This process, as I've said, is going to take some years. ICRP are consulting widely, and IRPA, among others, have set up a task group to respond to ICRP. From SRP, then we have a number of us representing SRP on the IRPA task group, including Roger Coates and Claire Louise Chappell. And we've responded so far to two requests for input to that task group, and I've just got a couple of slides on our second response, which I'll show you in a minute. We've set up a working group, an SRP working group, to feed into IRPA and also respond directly to ICRP when we have the opportunity. We'll show you here the membership, and importantly, that includes members of our partner societies. And the working group reports through CLIPS, the Committee for Liaison with IRPA and partner societies. And what I've shown here is the relationship between CLIPS, with the representation across the partner societies, and then feeding through to IRPA. So in terms of our latest response to IRPA, we provided input under these three headings: science, applications, and communications. So the essential question under science is, what will change, and will these changes warrant new recommendations? Will all the effort involved by ICRP and others really be justified? And then on applications, well, basically identified a number of issues where more information, more advice would be helpful. And the questions raised, so whether this can be done jointly, what the end result should be, would be agreement between ICRP and other international organisations on the way forward. And then on communications, following on from that, really calling for greater clarification on the coordination between international organisations. So very briefly, each of those in turn: the science, will there be a change away from around 5% perceive it? If so, by how much? And will that change protection? I think generally the changes proposed in ICRP publication 147 and the ICRU 95 report are welcomed, but are they of their own sufficient to warrant new recommendations? And then this last point here, usually with new recommendations, there is a new round of calculation of dose coefficients across the board. Is that really necessary? And noting that, as shown in that white box at the bottom, there's quite a bit more work still to be done in revising dose coefficients based on the 2007 recommendations, never mind a new set. So perhaps some sort of identifying what values need to change rather than changing everything would save a massive amount of work for ICRP and for those who need to implement these new values. Application of the system, yes, general agreement on this first point. More advice needed on ALARA and how it should be applied. And some other points raised in our response. Could natural background be used to contextualize the control of low doses, and looking at the variations in natural background, and then thinking about reducing low doses in the context of these variations, and identifying what might be a trivial dose under different circumstances, so you would then not need to push doses further down below these values. And this point about the approaches taken for different hazards. Are we doing the same with radiation as a carcinogen as for chemical carcinogens? If not, why not? And the last point there, more use of reference levels to avoid this use of limits as a boundary between, or can be seen as a boundary between, safe and unsafe. And then lastly on this, on communications, we delineated three sort of types of, or elements of communication. So it's communication between ICRP and the other international organizations, their communication to RP practitioners worldwide, and then communication with stakeholders and the wider public, with the initial focus of being on the international organisations, including ICRP, working together, firstly to decide the need for new recommendations. So, last slide, next steps. As Jim mentioned already, Pete Bryant and myself had we were able to go to the main commission meeting in Windsor in April, and present them directly with some of our ideas. Well, talk about ICRP more generally, and they were impressed to hear about what SRP are doing, but also talk about these ideas on their proposals for new recommendations. That was a good conversation we had with main commission members. The next opportunity is the 6th International Symposium of ICRP on the system of protection in November in Vancouver, and we will be represented there. And of course, we are responding to ICRP public consultations on reports, relevant reports, as they are put out for public consultation. And then we've now, from IRPA, been asked for another response, focusing this time on difficulties and challenges in application of the protection system in the regulatory framework. Please, we're representing all of you in providing input to IRPA and ICRP. So please, if you would like to, let us know your thoughts. For this, it needs to be before the end of this month, but you see my email address there, so I'd be very happy to hear from anyone on this specific topic, or any other opinions relevant to what ICRP is doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we take one or two specific questions for John at the end of that talk? There's one here. John, just there, from Hugh.
Thank you very much. Can I make it clear? I applaud the general approach, but a thought that was going through my mind, which I'd just like to just throw in to the mix. It's a comment on the process, really, of the SRP working group partnering with other UK societies and feeding into the IRPA task group. This should provide consensus and reassurance, but is it entirely consistent with diversity? Could it lead to the exclusion of emergent thinking, which is not mainstream, with some voices not being heard?
I think that, I mean, there's obviously the opportunity for members. I'm not quite sure exactly where these divergent views you're thinking they're going to come from. I mean, we are set up to represent SRP and the partner societies. We've set up the wherewithal to do that. I'm not sure who else we should be representing.
Yeah, very fair comment. To be honest, I was linking it with Selwyn's earlier discussion, and also, but you know, and also just wondering if there might be a danger of groupthink with the views that are then presented to ICRP.
Probably, but I'm not sure whether that's a good or a bad thing.
I think it's a good point to make that the more people that are involved in feeding into our task group or working group, the better, because hopefully we will avoid that groupthink and we will take all views into consideration. Thank you. Any other questions? There's one in the centre, middle there.
John Titley from the Environment Agency. I was just wondering, you spoke about the public dose coefficients and the fact they may be changing. Have you got any sense of the timescale for those? Is it going to follow on from the ICRP recommendations? We'll be waiting a few years, do you think, for those?
I think we're in the position at the moment where ICRP has yet to publish public dose coefficients based on the 2007 recommendations. So I think we're within the little list in that white box on one of the last few slides. So we would be a very long way off any further revision of public dose coefficients based on any new recommendations. So I think probably what you're asking is when will they be revised on the basis of the 2007 recommendations, and the answer must be within the next few years. ICRP have now completed all the sets of worker dose coefficients based on the 2007 recommendations, and they're well on with the first sets of public dose coefficients. And the first set should be out within a year, I would have thought.
Okay, let's open the floor. So, Selwyn, we'll see if there's any further questions for either speaker now. So, any other questions for Selwyn or for John?
You can always catch me later if you want to talk separately.
I know there was a comment on the Q&A, which was from a fellow dyslexic in the audience, Selwyn, who was saying that those adjustments really need to happen.
Yes, they're your only chance of getting anywhere. I've really enjoyed the work we had in here this morning, where one of the women volunteered to do the writing on the board. I wouldn't have had a chance in hell of writing up the comments we were working on in that kind of thing. And that's kind of an example in some ways of where somebody has stood up, took up over that. They had clear, precise writing. I could have probably done the presentation, but I wouldn't have wanted to have tried and written anything. It would have been very hard, especially handwritten. And without some of the adjustment software and the time given that people do give me to make those simple adjustments, you aren't going to get much written out of me. But if you want an answer to a question, I'll give it off the top of my head quite happily.
There's a question in the centre there, I see.
It's Rob Allett from the Environment Agency. I think you asked me, so I want to ask you a difficult question. So
Oh, good job. You might win a pot of honey. But I promise not to throw it at you from here.
So it was interesting your point about interviews and providing questions in advance. And actually, that's something I started to personally do in interviews when I'm interviewing people. But I wonder what your views are on equality versus equity. So about the fairness of providing everybody with the questions first, or maybe those who need reasonable adjustments, providing them even sooner than everybody else. I wonder if you have a view on that.
I think that's a really interesting question, and I haven't got an official answer, as I would call it. My gut feeling is that what you have to understand is whether you're trying to. There's two opposing points to your answer here. One is are you trying to make it easier for somebody to understand the question, because a person may interpret the question differently from what the actual interviewer is actually asking. And therefore it falls back on the skill of that interviewer to get the person actually on track to reply in the format that they want. I always thought that it would be more reasonable to give everybody the questions, but I also know plenty of dyslexics and dyspraxias who would say that would be unfair, because that would also give the other people, that is, a greater advantage as well. I think that's the problem I'm having with the discussions I'm having at the moment with inside the disability networks as to how long is a piece of string. I loved it when I got a whole week's worth of chance to do this. The story behind that is quite amusing. They didn't realise that I'd asked for reasonable adjustments and didn't give it to me. And I said my reasonable adjustment was the question at the end of the interview. So they then decided they had to re-interview me 2 weeks later, a week or so later, with the same questions. But then they improved all their practices for the whole of that organisation, so that would never happen again. But the answer to trying to answer your question is that I think a time beforehand is important, and making sure that it's an effective time, but not too long, and trying to find that balance of where it's enough for the person to actually understand the question and figure out what the questioner is trying to ask is more important. But you're right, non-neurodiverse people would also find that very helpful. So I'm not trying to get an added advantage for the hidden disabilities here, really. I'm trying to give them a chance to have an equal chance of replying.
Thank you. Sharon, we have a question at the front there from Sharon. The microphone's coming your way.
Thanks. This is another one for Selwyn. A lot of organisations have what they call positive discrimination or positive drivers to try and get their workforce to reflect the percentages of the population in their area, and also often have systems where if you notify that you're disabled, you almost automatically, if you fulfill the essential criteria, automatically put through for interview. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a brilliant idea, because I get a chance to go to lots of interviews and get given travel and assistance to go all around the country to interviews. It doesn't mean that I'll be any more successful at those interviews. I'm being slightly flippant there, of course. I think that what you're trying to do with the disability confidence schemes, or whatever you wish to call them, is to try and level that playing field so that they get to interview. So The problem that you might have is depending on your neurodiversity or whichever of your disabilities you've got two. One, some people won't even admit that they have a problem, and therefore their applications will therefore be difficult to actually pass the muster even on the enough, what's it called? Can't remember the right word, another of my problems. To make the minimum criteria for the interview, I'll do. And the other is the is that they may actually be better at the interview if they actually got to the interview, but you've already judged those people on their written capability. It's again what I was saying earlier. In some ways, I'm rambling a little about how what is it you want from that person that you want to have that job? What is the skills that you want? Do you want somebody who's really great at writing and can do a written, or do you want somebody who can do the job? And what is it you essentially want out of that skill? So the disability competence schemes, and those give you a chance to actually have a more diverse workforce, but they still have to pass the interview. They still have to do the best interview against the group they're doing. What you're doing here is giving them a chance that might have had a problem actually getting to the interview to be able to get that much more diverse set of candidates to go through. There is a lot of work that I want to do with inside the civil service in relation to this, because I've been able to get hold of some of the stats where we get reasonable percentages to an interview, a huge drop-off depending on their ability as to whether they actually pass the interview, and sometimes even a further drop-off who decide they don't even want to take up the job after they've been to the interview because of something else going on. Even the difficulty of moving between organisations and keeping your adjustments. Within the civil service, you have a thing called the personal passport that should allow you to take most of your adjustments across. But I also know from my personal family that one of my family members who has an adjustment has been told that they cannot keep their adjustment if they get a promotion in that organisation that they're in. And so they're actually thinking about leaving that organisation because they'll never get promoted because they won't be able to work on that next level. Most of us in this room would think that it's absolutely shocking. But that's what the HR person said in that organisation. So there's a lot more that can be done, and it's about really being able to get around it. So I've waffled way too much, but I think disability competence schemes are useful. They just gives you a greater lot of candidates. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll get greater lot of people under those equalities who get through.
Right. I think we'll take one last brief question, hopefully, and then we'll have to draw this session to an end. And then we'll have a brief comfort break, 10 minutes, and then we'll start the AGM. So Hugh.
Thanks, Jim.
one
Very
last question.
briefly. I think, I may be wrong, I think it was George Bernard Shaw who said that all professions are a conspiracy against the laity. The reason I mention that is that I'm coming back, John, on your point about whose other voices should we be thinking about taking into consideration. And it occurs to me that, there's SRP, IRPA and so on are professional societies, mainly physical scientists. There's also the social scientists, the anti-nuclear lobby, members of the public. And the reason I mention this is that if we, with agendas like the sustainability agenda, the climate change, is this an opportunity to try to bring in consensus from even from wider groups beyond the traditional societies? That's it.
I don't know whether that's really a question for me. That's one for you, Jim.
I think it's... Yeah, thanks, John. I think actually, in that case, they should have their own channels to feed directly to ICRP rather than come through us as a professional body representing radiation protection professionals. But they should be allowed the channel, but not through us. Right, okay, let's draw this session to a close by thanking our two speakers. And I've got them. One brief announcement, just to remind you, I have some keys here that were left earlier in the auditorium. So if they're yours.